On this episode of Behind the Headlines, we're incredibly privileged to meet with the CEO of a very unique organization called ReGrow. CEO Danielle Abraham, welcome to Behind the Headlines.
Thank you, Adam.
ReGrow is one of those very unique not-for-profits. It sits at the intersection of agriculture, national resilience, border security, Zionism, food security, innovation, philanthropy, and post-war reconstruction. Since October the 7th, it has deployed, and correct me if I'm wrong, Danielle, more than $28 million across hundreds of farms and communities in Israel. And it has done so to help regrow the agricultural sector. But is doing so while asking a very profound question. How do you rebuild stronger agriculture after agricultural terrorism? This is a really interesting question. So, Danielle, welcome to the program. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the work of ReGrow.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for having me, Adam. My accent's a bit of a giveaway. I'm originally from London. So originally a Brit, but I made Aliyah to Israel 16 years ago, really with this drive to represent Israel and what Israel has to offer on the international stage. And I was always looking for that opportunity. And before October the 7th, the NGO that I run, we were doing two things primarily. The first was advancing Israeli agricultural innovation at home in partnership with the Volcani Institute. And the second was sharing internationally Israel's agricultural experience and expertise with countries and partners around the world, because I believe that Israeli agriculture is, the most vastly underutilized tool that Israel has today to strengthen itself globally speaking. And when October 7th happened, all of that changed. I think all of our lives changed in that moment. We realized what was happening. And within 3 days, I had a board meeting of the NGO. And all of the board members basically shouted at me, Danielle, we're hearing about agricultural destruction. We hear about the volunteers that are rushing down to the farms to help save the produce. Why are we not doing something with our agricultural NGO? And so I said, okay, give us a moment. I said, tomorrow on October the 11th, we're going to hold an agricultural emergency meeting. I picked up the phone, I called the who's who of Israeli agriculture, the top scientists, the top agronomists, the top CEOs of the tech companies, the farmers, the partners, and we all came together. And that's where the ReGrow Israel project was born and then has since taken off.
Tell
So
us
that's a little
about
bit of the background and how it all
tell us
happened.
about the project. What is it that you do?
Well, we started off thinking, well, what value do we have to offer in this moment? And we decided it's obvious. We're going to act like the Israeli agricultural McKinsey, as it were. We're going to bring the top minds together alongside the farmers, and we're going to help them grow back stronger. We'll ask them, what are your dreams for the future? We'll come up with a strategic plan. And we thought it's going to be a short-lived 3-month project here in Israel. We went down to the farms on the Gaza border, and we saw something totally different. And we understood, because of agricultural terrorism, which is a story I'll tell, that there was no thinking strategically for the future. There was an emergency farming first aid crisis that first we had to get the farmers back on their feet. So it was very nice plans that we developed in the boardroom, but when you got to the field, we saw something entirely different.
So October 7th is described, and of course it is, a civilian massacre, military failure on Israel's
Yeah.
behalf, hostage crisis. It has many, many facets to it. You've used the term already, agricultural terrorism. What do you mean by that? And why is that a dimension that has been so overlooked in the story of October 7th?
So what do I mean by that? First of all, when I first went down south, there was destruction everywhere. As you might expect, you saw the pictures from the road of 232 of burnt vehicles. Well, the same existed in the kibbutzim and in the farms. So we saw burnt tractors, we saw mangled irrigation pipes, we saw chicken coops that were completely destroyed and dairy set on fire. And the initial understanding that I had was it was collateral damage because this was a war zone. There was a moment in Kibbutz Nahal Oz in those early weeks where I stood with the farmer Moran Freibach, and he told me, Danielle, I have to show you something crazy. Come over here. We're standing in the tractor yard, and he points at the floor, a broken box, okay? Broken plastic box that was broken open. On one side were mangled aerials, and on the other side was a mangled computer chipboard. And it was an irrigation control box. It's what allows the farmers in the kibbutzniks to drink their coffee on the kibbutz and open and close the irrigation pipes to the fields. He said, look at it, it's being targeted by Hamas and destroyed. I said, I see that. He said, you're missing the point. I've just done a full tour of all the fields of Nahal Oz, which are huge, and we have 40 irrigation boxes, and each one was targeted and destroyed. And that was the moment that the penny dropped, that the agricultural damage and destruction that we saw across the region was not collateral damage. It was intentional, it was strategic, and that is the reason we call it agricultural terrorism. Hamas knew exactly what they were doing, and they sought to target the key agricultural infrastructure which holds that region and keeps it alive. I think if you ask yourself why would Hamas do that? Why take the time away from the civilian population that we know they were targeting to target the agriculture? It becomes very clear if you take a moment to think about it. Number one, agriculture is a symbol of Zionism. Zionism is not a theoretical construct, it's a physical connection to the land. It's about working the land. Second, agriculture in the periphery and on the border of Gaza, it's the foundation of the economy of the region. Many of the communities rely entirely on agriculture for their income. And third, it's part of national food security. The Western Negev is called the breadbasket of Israel. It doesn't produce any bread, but that's what we call it. And then you ask, why was this story overlooked? I think there's two answers to that. The first is the human story and the atrocities that occurred was so big and so painful and so heavy. It captures all the attention, and justifiably so. The story of the hostages demands and deserves the attention on the front page. The second reason, I think, is that there was no one to tell the story. We've done a little bit in telling the story, but I said from the beginning, we are always going to prioritize doing over speaking. I know you need both, but with limited resources, we prioritize responding, and now we're telling the story.
I think it's probably also compounded by a simple thing that agriculture can be regrown and regrown quickly. I went down to Nahal Oz on this recent visit and met with Amir Tibon down there, and we had a chat, and I said, how come I can see everything has been rebuilt? He said, because we're living. We're not here to memorialize, we're here to live and to replant and regrow and rebuild. In February 24, Danielle, I visited Israel, and I went down to Ofakim to volunteer in the fields because the farmer had told me that his Thai workers had all been killed on October 7, and he had all this produce in the fields that was unpicked. And most of us think about October 7 as unpicked produce or food not gathered in, crops not taken up. But what you're describing is something more profound, right? Which is why I think the term agricultural terrorism is a really good one, because it was deliberate. It was a deliberate, very strategic. Because most people think of farming as an economic activity, and we can just regrow it. Why is it a strategic national asset from that perspective that you're asking? How does a vineyard or the dairy farm at Nahal Oz become part of the national security perspective, the national resilience of a country?
I will answer that in three ways. I think there's three key ways. The agriculture is part of a strategic national asset for the state of Israel, and in my mind, it's overlooked and undervalued. The first is in terms of food security, right? In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, Israel increased its imports from abroad by over 60,000 tons in the first 2 months. This is huge. You look at where we were importing from, we increased imports from countries like Turkey. God forbid Israel becomes dependent for food imports from places like Turkey, who in the middle of the war decided they're actually going to restrict exports to Israel for geopolitical reasons. it is very important for countries today not to be overly dependent on the globalized trade of food and actually have a strong domestic agricultural production base, or at least diversified sources of imports. We can never produce all the food we need to eat here, but it's very important we have a strong agricultural production. So in terms of the food security, this is why agriculture is more than an economic engine. In addition, there's a real value in terms of national security for agriculture in Israel. You know, you have that story that the kibbutzim tell you. If you turned off the lights in the state of Israel and only turned on the lights on the kibbutzim, you will see the map and the outline of the state of Israel. The kibbutzim were intentionally placed on Israel's borders in terms of national security. And if they're doing anything in the periphery and on the borders, it's agriculture. And they said, you know, if the kibbutzim and the communities in the periphery were not out there in the north and out there on the border of Gaza, Hezbollah and Hamas could have met in Tel Aviv on October the 7th. And these communities and the agricultural communities across the periphery and across the borders are holding the borders. I have a lot of conversations with security officials here that explain to me, Danielle, if it's a normal town that does not do agriculture on the border, during the day, the only population in the vicinity are the kids at school. Everyone leaves to go to the office. If it's an agricultural settlement, people are there in the community, they're across the fields working. It's not so easy to infiltrate, so it's a real national security asset. I will throw in something else that I think people don't really think about, which takes me back to our international work. Israel has created an agricultural miracle here. We are genuinely leaders in agricultural technology, innovation, in climate resilient agriculture, in water use efficiency, and countries across the world, whether we have diplomatic relations with them or not, are all reaching out to Israel for assistance. Climate change, food security, water stress are real security concerns for countries around the world. The question is, are we utilizing the agricultural technology and innovation and experience that we have to build these bridges of peace, of collaboration, of diplomatic capital? So I think it's a national asset also in that sense as well, which is often, very often overlooked.
You remind me of the conversations that Israeli leaders had in the 60s and 70s, in fact, even earlier. I mean, the placing of the kibbutzim on the periphery was very much a national security goal. But you remind me of the conversations of, you know, Golda Meir going to Africa and leveraging Israel's incredible agricultural technology, even then, you know, even in the 60s and 70s, and working with Africa because it was right to do so while creating the diplomatic capital.
Yeah.
But we've never reaped that diplomatic capital, Danielle. And that's, you raise that again, and I'm going, oh, I've heard that story. You know, that Israel is working with the Arab world closely on high tech. It's still working in Africa with agri-tech. But the diplomatic capital doesn't really ever come. Or am I misreading the situation?
I think it depends. Do we need to see the diplomatic capital played out on the front of the newspapers, or can it be in the quiet conversations and deals behind the scenes? I think the other element I would mention in this instance is that I believe, which is why I'm working in an NGO, that there has been a huge missed opportunity to approach this strategically with a long-term vision and plan and put the required resources behind it. I acknowledge the fact that Golda Meir's efforts were brilliant, and still, because of the pressure of the Arab League, African nations broke off relations with Israel in the 70s. You know, that was kind of the demise of Mashav, Israel's version of US aid. I do believe it's strategic. I do believe it has diplomatic capital. I don't think it always has to play out on the front of the newspapers. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. And arguably, that's almost always more powerful. And still, I don't think the right strategy is being implemented or the resources put towards it. Should that be done in an NGO setting? I'm not sure, but we're going to be doing that anyway.
Yeah. Couple of statistics before we keep going on this by way of background. We know that the majority of exports now of Israel are high tech. Where's agriculture in terms of the national economy? What percentage of GDP? How much is Israel growing? Are you able to provide us with sort of some of the basics around the Israel agricultural sector?
Oh, I don't want to say numbers offhand. As a percentage of the national GDP, agriculture is very, very small.
Right.
And my argument for agriculture is not because it today is a driver of the national economy and GDP in terms of the agricultural in the fields itself. It's because it's a driver and a foundation of the economies on the border. It holds, anchors the communities to the border. It provides a food security asset and a national strategic asset. I think if we try and frame the agricultural production in Israel in terms of national GDP, then we've almost missed the point. But it's very small and less than 5%. But I don't want to throw out some numbers.
Yeah, but food security clearly in a world where national strategic resilience is critical is the big part of the equation, and I hear that. The statistics we do have from what's happened up in the north, thousands of missiles. People just,
Mhm.
I don't think, fully understand just how much devastation. Burned farmland. I'm reminded of incendiary balloons sent over from Gaza, whose sole purpose is to destroy fields. But, we've got it in the north as well, destroyed orchards, abandoned vineyards. What what did you see there that on the ground up north that convinced you, not just in the south with Nahal Oz, but in the north, that there's no longer it's not a recovery challenge of one area of Israel, but it's a national emergency everywhere? What convinced you of that?
I think there was two things. I think first it was the scale and scope of the damage, which is across the entire northern region, which is larger than the western Negev. And the second thing which disturbed me the most, which convinced me, is that we were over a year and a half on. There was already been a ceasefire. And I stood on the border with these farmers who refused to leave their land. They never left. They stood under fire. And they told me, Danielle, we're standing here under fire because of Zionism and our belief that we should be here. We are here to hold the borders. We are here to produce out of the land of Israel. And this is Zionism.
Yeah.
But there's no one standing behind us. We have received no support, no recognition, no thanks. And so we're telling our children, this Zionism is something of the past. Don't stay. I do not want my child to follow in my footsteps and to hold the border, to produce orchards on this land. It's not something that's valued anymore. This is something of the past. I'm telling my children to leave. And that is what convinced me this is an emergency of national scale. We cannot afford to see our communities and families leave the periphery and the border on the north. We cannot afford that. That is the future of the state of Israel. And therefore, I see support of these families, support of these farmers to help them hold the land and to make it productive again and a source of economic engine for the region as a very, very high priority.
You remind me of the story of Nahal Oz, because we'd spoken about that some years ago, after one of the many wars with Hamas, a quarter of the population left, families, young families left because young kids were being unfortunately killed there by mortar strikes. And then the kibbutz grew again because people realized from a nationalist perspective, purely from a Zionist perspective, that the borderland, the growth of agriculture was security, not just national security from a physical sense, but also from a food sense, but also from a life and a livelihood. And if you've been to these kibbutzim, they're amazing. Like, they're just amazing places. They're idyllic. Other than rockets flying over their head, they're idyllic in so many different ways. If if I have it right, let me get the numbers up. You're trying to replant, I think, 550,000 fruit trees in the north and
Mm-hmm.
260,000 vines. I mean, these are extraordinary, extraordinary numbers. We get the urgency because we've got to do it, but I understand that part of that is about a planting window as well. So tell us about that plan in the north, what you're doing, if you can confirm all these numbers and why it's so urgent right now.
Yeah, so I can definitely confirm those numbers. We have over 1,250 acres of orchards and vines, vineyards completely destroyed. They need to replant urgently. Number one, there is a planting window of time where we want to help the farmers actually plant. It's better in a certain season. And secondly, let's not forget, you said, agriculture can recover very quickly. Field crops can recover very quickly. Maybe chicken coops, if you bring in the new chicks, can recover very quickly. Orchards and vines take 4 years.
Mm.
We're already nearly 3 years on from October the 7th, and many, many farmers haven't replanted yet. So it's going to take 4 years for these fruit trees and the vines to actually produce fruit and to become profitable. And they desperately need it for their livelihoods. We keep saying, let's rebuild the north, let's regrow. Well, this is how we get people back on their feet. And they're going to have
Yeah.
to wait another 4 years. And so we don't want to wait any longer. But yes, it is over 500,000 fruit trees and 250,000 vines.
Extraordinary. And I think it's over 100 communities just in the north
Mhm.
alone. Danielle, what have you learned about the psychology of Israeli farmers in the ag sector since October 7th? I mean, you know, I've got to say it, most people I West would just sort of pack up and go somewhere quieter, right? But what keeps them going when so many have lost homes, and the workers, like I saw down south in Ofakim, crops, income, what keeps people going there?
It's amazing. It really is amazing. I often tell people that we have in our head, in our historical imagination, a black and white image of the original pioneer that made the desert bloom, right? They have a hoe in one hand and they have an old-fashioned rifle in the other, and they went off to the border in horrific conditions, either, fighting malaria, draining the swamps, or clearing the desert of rocks to make the desert bloom. And I'm telling people that these figures in our historical imagination are not just in our imagination, they are living, breathing on our borders today, because they are the farmers that you will meet on the border of Gaza and on the border of Lebanon across the north. When I went there straight after October 7th, they were already there. In the south, they were evacuated out that night, and they went back on October the 8th, October the 9th, October the 10th. And in the north, as I said, they never left.
Mm.
What is the psychology that enabled them to do that or drove them to do that? First is the ideology, it's the Zionism. But I'll tell you a story of something else. Yair, he's the head of the dairy at Kibbutz near Yitzhak. And he told me, in the day or two straight after October the 7th, he couldn't think about the cows. Members of his family were missing. They didn't know if they were murdered or taken hostage. He said, I had no brain space and capacity to think about the cows. 2 days later, the only thing that kept him going were the cows. I think in an emergency, there's some kind of adrenaline response. We all felt it in Israel. The diaspora felt it across the world. Do you want to do something? There's this urge for action. And I think the psychology of not only holding that Zionist belief and ideology, but actually wanting to do and to be productive is what drove them in those first few days. I think it's a form of adrenaline. I tell you what's even more impressive. It's not just that they went back under fire in the south and never left in the north, is that they keep going. It's remarkable. Once the adrenaline fades, once reality sets in, once you start to feel the loss and the enormity of what happened, because at the beginning you're a bit numb because you have to be. But to keep going and to keep going, and not just to rebuild, but always to look to the future, that is the remarkable psychology to my mind.
What's the what's what's the drive? Is it this sense that I found in my recent trip, this sense of mission and purpose in Israel that you just don't see anywhere else, and you clearly can't manufacture. You keep using the word Zionism, of course, the belief in
Yeah.
the link between the people, the land, and the spirit of the people, for want of a better word. Is it deep as that, or is there something else that's driving this?
Well, I don't want to say the Jewish mother, but I feel like there is a condition for the Jewish people that we're perpetually unsatisfied. We're always trying to think to do something better or think to do something bigger. We're trying to improve, there's something in the makeup. I can't put my finger on it. It's not Zionism. It's kind of maybe it is the psychology inherited from the Jewish mother. You could always do better. You only got 100%. Why not 101%? But in the wake of a disaster,
Yeah.
there is an opportunity. And it's not just to rebuild as things were. The real opportunity is to rebuild better. And I heard it first from the farmers, to grow back stronger, to rethink. Let's
Yes.
challenge the status quo. If we have to put this huge effort in anyway, let's do it better. Why rebuild what was?
It's a theme in your reports, actually, that phrase "grow back stronger," I think. It's a striking theme because you're moving in what I've read, you've moved from emergency relief to
Mhm.
assist
Yeah.
and stabilize, and now to grow back stronger. We would think, "Oh, just simply rebuild what you had," because that was going successful. So what you're doing is now different again. So tell us a little bit about that. And just make a side note. Your comment about the Jewish mother, I think, is really powerful because it's not actually the Jewish mother. Rabbi Sachs, God rest his soul, used to talk about the eternal restlessness of the Jewish people,
Mhm.
the inability to accept the world as it is, and the inner desire to strive to make it better and stronger and more just and more moral. Not that if you were a reader in any Western media anymore would believe that of us, but it is what he said, that eternal restlessness. And I think you're right. I think and it comes back to this: grow back stronger. Don't just rebuild with something else. Tell us about what's happening there.
That was definitely a more articulate way of putting it, this eternal restlessness.
Yeah.
I like that. I'm going to take that as part of our work. And Rabbi Sachs was fantastic. And how are we interpreting that? Well, actually, as we looked at the Israeli agriculture, we noticed a big dissonance between what you see in the fields and the agri-tech innovation that Israel is so well known for. And so the first question we asked is, well, why is the innovation not being implemented in the fields here in Israel? What are the barriers? Why are we not living, the innovative reputation that we had? And so one of the key things that we're doing is trying to upgrade the technological standing of the farms. That in itself is not the goal. We're trying to increase productivity, profitability, climate resilience, and environmental sustainability. But very many of the instant ways that you can do that is by taking commercialized technologies and implementing them in the farms to get results very quickly. The second way is that we are funding semi-proven technologies and new approaches. We're taking the risk, we're testing them in field conditions and trying to see what works, which they can then be rolled out. And the third thing we're doing is investing funding in applied agricultural research. So really in the science and the research, but not for science sake. It's connected to the field. You see a challenge in the field and you get a scientist to try and come up with a solution that would really tangibly address the problems there. They're the three ways that we're trying to push this grow back stronger. And we're continually trying to challenge the mindset. Do it bigger, do it better, do it more productively, do it more profitably, do it more in a way that's more climate resilient. And
Amazing.
I will just say one thing is that what's special about Israel in many countries around the world when there's a crisis, they need to bring help from outside. And I keep telling everyone here, we have everything we need to save ourselves. We just have to be organized enough to put it together, build the right plan, and bring the resources to make it happen.
Can you give us an example where you've started to apply the tech a little bit differently now? And I know it's early because we can't say we're going to see the yield, but where are some good examples of this happening?
So we have two big flagship innovation programs in the Western Negev. One is in the greenhouse sector, which is primarily dominated by the Moshavim, and one is in the dairy sector, which again is primarily dominated by the kibbutzim, because it was important for us to serve every farmer.
Explain just for listeners the difference between the words you've used, a moshav and a
Yep.
kibbutz. What are the differences between those two agricultural communities?
So a kibbutz is a real cooperative. It's almost got one farm. It's one farm, and the revenue from that farm goes to support the entire community as a whole. That's on a kibbutz. A moshav is not a cooperative in the same way. On a moshav, you have a community, but you have individual families who have private businesses for agriculture. So you might have a moshav with 35 farms, for example, And whilst they share certain resources like shared water infrastructure, all of the other inputs are individualized to each private farm within the moshav. So one is a cooperative with all shared farming infrastructure, and one is individual private farms within a larger community
So
of
one is
moshav.
shared resources, Moshav, and the kibbutz, the traditional socialist
Traditional kibbutz.
collective. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, So in the dairy, what we did for the dairy innovation, first we wanted to change the mindset of the farmers. We wanted to showcase what is out there. So we had a whole season, as it were, 3 months, where we took all the dairy farmers of the Western Negev to a huge technological expo in Germany to see all the different kinds of technologies, what's possible. Let's open people's minds to think outside the box, to show them something new. And we sent them there with some of the top dairy experts here in Israel to provide advice so they can consult. It's powerful that they were there together. We then brought them home to Israel and we did some tours around Israel to see some of the cool technology being developed here at home. And then we did a big expo day here in Israel where startups and technological companies could come and showcase. We then provided them with an open call for a grant opportunity and said, please now apply for funding, up to 70% funding as a grant, to actually try and implement some of these innovations. This was phase one. So different innovations that we have the first robotic milking machine now in Kibbutz Nahal Oz being trialed and tested. We have special sensors and cooling systems because Israel has the most productive dairy cow in the world. It produces the most milk, which is quite astounding considering the cows are in the desert because the heat reduces the milk production. One of the key ways they do that is by cooling the cow. The cow literally goes to the cow spa. It's sprayed with water, like mist water, and the fans are working. And this smart system, the cooling system, which is the new technology, has sensors which can actually read the core body temperatures of the cows. It only sprays and activates the fans where in the vicinity and if needed. So it saves on all of the energy and the input costs, and it's much smarter and it has all the data about the cows. So we've been implementing different kinds of technologies while we are doing both an economic analysis and an agronomic analysis to see the impact of them. It's very important to be able to showcase the impact it has practically speaking and the economic impacts. We mustn't forget that farm is a business at the end of the day, and we need to be able to show
Yeah.
that there's an ROI and there's a reason for investment in these technologies.
I saw, in fact, before October 7th, some years ago, I went to a dairy and the output of litre per cow, forgive me the numbers, but it was something in the order of 6 times what we produce in Australia. And
Mhm.
there's no arable land. I mean, Australia, we've got these vast tracts of grassland for dairy cows, and we do a great job producing, quality milk and cheese output. But in Israel, the cows in less land were producing, you know,
Yeah.
5, 6, 7 times literage per cow. It's an extraordinary thing when the
Yeah.
technology is applied so carefully and so well, and not costly either.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us about. I know there's something called the Greenhouse Innovation Project. I'm really interested in that one. Tell us about that because what I understand, it wasn't that in this case farmers weren't lacking the ideas. In the dairy sector, they went and found the best ideas and applied them. Here, they weren't lacking the ideas. It was something around confidence and support. Tell us about the Greenhouse Project and, most importantly, in the agricultural sector, it's probably wider than that. It tells us a lot about how innovation actually happens. What did you discover in this particular project?
So we discovered that many of the greenhouse farmers across the Western Negev in the Moshavim primarily, so the privatized versions of the communities, were barely breaking even. They were in a cycle of underinvestment because of the stressful economic situation of the production. They're producing primarily tomatoes or vegetables in the greenhouses. And we understood that in order to break the cycle of underinvestment, we have to boost profitability. And we thought there's a fantastic opportunity there to introduce technologies. So we ran the program in a very similar way to the dairies, and that's what we did. What does it tell us about how innovation happens and the farmers? Well, what we learned is that Israeli farmers are like farmers across the world, incredibly conservative. I feel like if you're going to become a farmer, it has to be in your DNA. You must be risk averse. Farming is an incredibly fraught practice. You know, there's risks everywhere. There's pests, there's unexpected seasons. It's all out of your control. And the profit margins are not huge. And so you have to be risk averse in order to survive. Yet we know the Israeli farmers are very curious. They like to be innovative. They like to think outside the box. They're also very well educated. They do want to try new things, and that's what we've shown. But they need that support package. So how does innovation really happen? I think, there's 4 stages of innovation. The first is you've got to actually develop the innovation and come up with the idea. How does that happen? There's that fancy cliche, what is the necessity is the mother of all invention. It's pretty much the same. You have a pain point and then you come up with a solution. And that's what we've seen a lot. I think then, especially in the farm sector, you have to test it. We have to absorb the risk with philanthropic money or with government funding to actually showcase to the farmers, this works. We cannot put the risk on the farm population to do that.
Or
That's what we've done.
alternatively, it doesn't work. And in
Exactly.
Israel, the critical cultural difference is you learn from failure is learning.
Yes,
In much of the rest of the world, failure is disaster, right? It's
correct.
a big cultural difference. It's huge.
Yes. And we want to take the risk. We want to fail. We want to see what works, what
Yeah.
doesn't work. And then we adapt it and we tweak it and we change. And then I was often asked by ministers of agriculture across Africa, how do you convince Israeli farmers to adopt the technology, which is the next stage, technological adoption, innovation adoption? I said, what are you talking about? We often have experiments in the fields, okay, to test the technology, see if it works. As soon as it looks like it's working, I said, Israeli farmers are already running out with the adoption of the technology. And we're sometimes saying, wait, it hasn't been proven yet. We want to check the ROI, but they can already see it works, so they're running. And so the ministers of agriculture across Africa are saying, well, how do we teach our farmers to do that? But it's a mindset thing.
It's a
It's
mindset.
a
It is a
mindset.
mindset thing. Early adoption is not early adoption in Israel. It's adoption.
Exactly. It's adoption.
Yeah.
Yet we still see an adoption curve in the same way. But yes,
Yes.
many
Yeah.
farmers want to innovate, but they need to do it in a safe way.
Yeah, of course they do. One of the most fascinating findings I read in one of your reports about that greenhouse pilot was profitability can actually begin earlier and production costs can fall dramatically through technology adoption. I mean, there's a logic to that, but the profitability piece. So are we witnessing the birth of a new model for Israeli agriculture here?
So I wish it was that easy, is my answer. I think to witness the birth of a new model for agriculture, we need to think about systemic change. I think our greenhouse program has done something fantastic and it has shown what is possible. But we cannot continually come in with pinpoint programs and initiatives. We have to create a model that can continually support change. For example, we're exploring the idea of a revolving innovation fund. So farmers could continually have access to funding that could remove the risk to try new technologies. And if they work, then they could pay it back into the fund. So that to me would support the new model of Israeli agriculture. But yes, I really hope that we're moving in that direction, that we could always make technology and innovation accessible to Israeli farmers, that they could adopt them. And I think then farmers around the world would be looking to that model. So would governments.
Yeah, they would. I mean, it's like, and I've met them many times, the Israel Innovation Authority. When we bring missions to Israel, especially tech missions, I mean, their job is to seed tech startups. And, if they get a failure rate that's not high enough, then they're not taking enough risk. That's what they keep telling us. I'm hearing there's a model here for agriculture too, that there should be, that sort of seed funding allowing the experimentation to drive early profitability, lower production costs over time. That would be an amazing thing for ReGrow.
Yes, that's what we're looking at for 2027. We just got to crack the model. We've got a brilliant team working on it right now, but I think that is the model. But I also would like to re-emphasize that we are an NGO, and part of our success is going to be to incentivize and facilitate and enable scale. And to enable that, you need to both be able to crowd in larger capital sources, whether it's private capital, and also the role of government. So we have done some pilots in different areas, which the government are now looking at, saying perhaps that's interesting, we could scale it now.
Yes.
So I think as an NGO, we have to be strategic. We have to always think about scale. It's amazing. What we've done today is amazing. You know, we've raised $40 million and we're deploying it across the south and the north, and we're seeing real change on the ground. It's still too small. We
Yeah.
have to think about scale from the beginning.
In a small country with small land, I love that. We've got to think of scale. Danielle, it occurs to me as we're talking about, we're using the phrase the Negev or the Western Negev or parts of the Negev, right? Or the Arava, which is below the Jordan Sea. For many of my listeners, they don't understand that geography. And I'd like you to spend a minute talking about it, because it links to the idea, the Zionist tradition of making the desert bloom. And if you can, describe for me the terrain, the geography, the climate of these places in the Negev, these moshavim and kibbutzim. Where are they? And what are they? What is it like for someone who has no idea of that geography? What it is that's there, and what farmers are doing?
All right, let me try and paint the picture for the listeners.
Yeah.
I'll start by saying Israel is a stupid place to do agriculture. Okay, to do agriculture, you can often think of a green land, fertile soil, lots of rainfall, all of the conditions, flat. Israel, and a lot of land, you need a lot of land to do good agriculture, as you said before, Adam. Let's look at Israel. Israel is a tiny, tiny country. It's very long and narrow, as it were, and it contains within it so many different climatic and conditions throughout the country. From the north, which is very, very high and much colder, where the orchards are grown, on the border of Lebanon, which we've now seen destroyed. And as you come down, Israel becomes increasingly dry and barren and deserty, which means, 2/3 of Israel is a desert. It means that the sand and the soil is really sand. If you come down to the Western Negev, if they are not producing farms in the Western Negev on the Gaza border, what you would see there is sand. It would be brown and it wouldn't be green. It's very hot, it's very dry. There is a lack of natural water resources in the region. And that takes you back to the story of David Ben-Gurion, who wanted to make that region of the Negev and the Arava, this vast sector of the bottom of Israel, which is all desert. He wanted to make it bloom. And the story is, they said, well, that's ridiculous. We need water to make it bloom, and there aren't natural water resources there. And David Ben-Gurion said, that's okay. We'll take the water from the Sea of Galilee, which is in the north of Israel, 250 kilometers down south through the pipe, and then we'll make the desert bloom, which is not a natural place to do agriculture, which we're seeing. And the story goes that they said, well, that's a crazy idea, it's impossible. And he said, well, bring me the engineers that will make it possible.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, 10 years later, we have this beautiful picture in black and white of a very young Shimon Peres standing next to Ben-Gurion, opening Israel's national water carrier. And Israel has this fantastic infrastructure to move water across the countries, because this area in the Negev, in the Arava, where these moshavim and kibbutzim are doing agriculture, is completely crazy. We must not forget that it's like a living miracle. They have cows standing in the middle of the desert producing milk. You go down, you see the colors change out the car window, right? From green in the middle and north of Israel to brown. And then suddenly out of the sand, you see greenery. You see greenhouses, you see productivity, you see date palms, you see potato fields, it's wheat fields. It's remarkable.
Well, my
I
favorite
think we
is
mustn't lose sight of the miracle there.
my favorite is strawberries the size of my fist growing in sand, right? Through
Yes.
hydroponic, very, very specialized hydroponic agriculture. It is the example. Gigantic strawberries, tasty too, or rock melons growing on trellises in greenhouses in the middle of 40-degree, desert conditions day after day. That's what it is, right? So that's what making the desert bloom. That's the story. You've painted it well.
Yeah.
So is what you're doing, is what ReGrow, the organization, doing, the continuation of that original Zionist project? And if it is, because you made the comment earlier about younger farmers or younger Israelis not connecting to this, right? Especially under, the battlefield conditions. How are you getting younger Israelis to connect to these, you know, bedrock, and it's the right metaphor, bedrock ideology about agriculture, the land, and the people?
A really interesting question. So, for me personally, and I think for all of our team, yes, this is a continuation of the Zionist project, the Zionist dream, and this effort to build the state of Israel. It's funny you asked because in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, after we discovered the agricultural terrorism, and I realized I had to raise $12.5 million in a week to help repurchase all the equipment for all the farmers across the Gaza border region, many donors initially said to me, "But Danielle, what's agriculture? We don't do agriculture. We support with our philanthropy community development. We support economy and livelihoods." And it took me a moment to say, number one, economy and community on the border regions is agriculture. And number two, have we forgotten where we've come from?
Mm.
Jewish philanthropy 2 generations ago was always about putting money into, the blue box to go to the land of Israel. We were purchasing tractors, we were supporting planting trees, we were building irrigation infrastructure. And I believe we've come full circle back to that moment again where we're looking to rebuild our country and we should start from our roots. So yes, for me personally and our team, we very much see this as a continuation of the Zionist project. What does that mean for new Israelis, the young Israelis and new farmers? Do they connect to that? I think yes, but there's one thing to connect to it abstractly in terms of ideology and as an idea. There's another thing to actually go and do it. Does the next generation of Israelis want to become farmers? Is it an easy choice? No, not today. And that is our big challenge. How do we attract the new generation of farmers into farming in Israel?
So if Ben Gurion were alive, right, the great man were alive today,
Yes.
and he was standing with us, and he's looking at these burnt orchards of the north and the devastation in the south, what would he say to not just the farmers who've chosen to stay and rebuild, but what would he say to young Israelis about this mission that you've articulated so beautifully?
So I've cheated, but I've got a quote from David Ben-Gurion of what he said then, which I think is as apt then as it is today. And he said that the land of Israel was built with the sweat and toil of pioneers who refused to give up. And we do not dream of the future, but we build it. And I think that is the task of our generation. And I think we're in an incredibly privileged position to take those words as inspiration and to go and do. And it's a real privilege to be able to do that. So I think
10
that's
years from now, Danielle, 10 years from now, we look back, you and I interview again,
yeah.
and we're both in good health. I mean, same spirit as we are today. You know, 10 years from now, we look back and you go, that was amazing. That was a successful journey. What will you see? What will you hear? What will you feel in Israel and in the agricultural sector of Israel?
Well, I think we don't do the conversation here, but we'll do it walking through the fields on the border regions. We'll see a new generation of farmers, average age 30, 35. We'll see high-tech innovations active in their farms, which are productive and profitable and climate resilient. The farmers will be smiling because they're secure in what they're doing. And you're going to see international delegations as well walking around these farms because they're all coming once again to learn from the state of Israel that it's not just that moral and ethical obligation to share and to be a light into the nations, but it's going to be strengthening Israel's position again on the global stage.
Amen to that.
Ben.
I intend to be in Israel later this year, so I'll take you up on that offer of walking through the
With
fields
pleasure.
together, and let's walk through and chat and talk about what was and what is, more importantly, and the hope that it's building in the rebuilt agricultural sector. Danielle Abraham, extraordinary journey, CEO of ReGrow. Send us your details. We'll add it to the podcast so people can find it. But just very simply, what's your email, what's your website? Give us your website details.
ReGrowIsrael.org.
ReGrowIsrael.org, and can contribute in many ways, the rebuilding of the land. Danielle, thank you for your time today on Behind
Thanks
the
so much
Headlines.
for having me. Toda rabba.